on commerce, trade, and consumer protection will come to order. We thank those who are gathered here for this hearing, and the chair recognizes himself for 2 minutes for opening statement. And the chair wanted to admonish members that anyone other than the full committee chair or the full committee ranking member or the chairman emeritus will be encouraged to limit their opening remarks to 2 minutes because of the time consideration for some of our witnesses. April 20th was a tragic day for the people of the Gulf Coast region of the United States. 11 workers died following an explosion on the Deepwater Horizon oil drilling rig located 40 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. Since that tragic day, an estimated 50 to 150 million gallons of oil have leaked into the Gulf, severely damaging our environment, destroying people's way of life, and severely damaging the entire region's economy. Tourism is the Gulf region's second largest industry. It generates more than $39 billion in state revenue. Tourism represents 46% of the region's economy. Tourism employs over 1 million people. Various studies indicate that this oil spill has put 300,000 jobs at risk, representing 15% of the total job base in the region. The saddest part of this story is that some of the businesses that are impacted today were still recovering from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which occurred over 5 years ago. Now that BP has created a $20 billion claims pool to compensate victims who have been impacted by the oil spill, the purpose of this hearing is to make sure that the travel and tourism industry will not be left behind, that they will be included. One might ask why. Well, I'm glad you asked. Because of the intricacy of that particular industry, the complexity of the methodology that needs to be employed to determine the level of damages and fair compensation, and because of the tourism's vast economic impact on the entire Gulf Coast region. Furthermore, we have learned from the massive media coverage of the oil spill and by various studies by the tourism industry itself that it is losing business not only because the beaches may not be safe, but also because travelers perceive that it is not safe to travel to the Gulf Coast region of the U.S. We've also heard the concerns of the industry about the claims process, its time frame for compensation and eligibility. Finally, we have to consider what needs to be done to bring back the industry to the stature it had before the oil spill. These are difficult issues we have to examine here today. The complexity of the matter may require more than one hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing before this subcommittee. We have concerns about the tourism industry and how it will be compensated and how it will be revitalized. And I hope our discussion today is a very fruitful and productive one. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Now I recognize the ranking member for 2 minutes. 2 minutes or 5 minutes? 2 minutes. 5 minutes.
That's fine, whatever. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I want to welcome all the witnesses today. We appreciate Mr. Feinberg being with us, as well as representatives of the tourism industry. We know that since the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig on April 20th, the Gulf Coast economy has faced many difficult challenges. We also know that this is the summer peak months for tourism, and that many people have been adversely impacted by this incident. It's my understanding that BP, prior to the Gulf Coast Claims Fund being set up, gave Florida $25 million to promote tourism, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama $15 million each to counter the publicity and the impact, the perception that it would not be open for tourism. BP has been paying claims to businesses affected by the spill. They've paid out, it's my understanding, over $200 million thus far in claims. It's not surprising that some businesses are having difficulty getting their claims processed quickly because really BP is not an insurance company. The administration of the claims process is being handled by Mr. Feinberg. He certainly has experience in this arena, having dispersed funds as a result of the 9/11 incident. It's my understanding that he's going to be taking control of 36 BP offices and 1,500 employees established to pay claims to qualified businesses. Mr. Feinberg is charged with administering the entire $20 billion Gulf Coast claims account and paying legitimate claims to affected parties. It is an admirable and certainly a difficult position because we know that paying claims in this kind of situation is certainly an inexact science. Will it be restricted to the beach resorts only, or will downstream suppliers to the tourism industry qualify for compensation? There are a lot of unanswered questions. We do want to see that people are reimbursed who have legitimate claims. We know that there will be some people filing claims that are not legitimate, but that is one of the challenges that Mr. Feinberg faces. And then one other question that I think is going to have to be answered as we go along is the drilling moratorium imposed by the administration is certainly going to have an impact on the economy up and above the impact on the tourism as a result of the spill. And there's going to have to be some questions asked about who should pay for the cost of that moratorium. Should it be the government? Should it be BP? So there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I know that this committee is totally committed to making sure that everyone receives compensation that deserves it. We look forward to your expertise, your thoughts on this important subject, and certainly look forward to all your testimony. Thank you.
The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico is the worst environmental disaster this country has ever seen. And while we have every hope that the cap will hold and the flow of oil into the Gulf is truly stopped, we know that the devastation is enormous and its effects will continue for years. In the 3 months since the Deepwater Horizon explosion and blowout, the Committee on Energy and Commerce has held 8 hearings examining the causes of the explosion, efforts to mitigate the damage, and the impacts on the environment and the local community. I'd like to thank Chairman Rush for holding our 9th hearing, which will focus on the impacts of the spill on tourism and the tourism economy in the Gulf area. The economies of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida are heavily dependent on the travelers who come to the Gulf Coast beaches each summer for swimming, fishing, and other activities. Across each of these 4 states, some beaches are closed and significant fishing grounds are still off limits. Hotels, restaurants, charter boats, and resorts are facing cancellations. Tourists are shying away from the areas of the Gulf even where no oil has come ashore. Diners and grocery shoppers across America are asking about whether the seafood is from the Gulf and whether it is safe to eat. Today we'll hear from tourism officials and businesses from each of the 4 states dealing with this catastrophe. We'll also hear from Kenneth Feinberg, the independent administrator in charge of handling all claims for damage and loss of the oil spill. He is responsible for determining the proper level of compensation for each business, worker, and family impacted by the spill. This hearing will give the committee a better understanding of the impacts of the spill on an essential part of the Gulf Coast economy and help us understand what we can do further to help the region recover. I thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to their testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, for 2 minutes. For 1 minute, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see the ranking member down there.
I'm willing to let Mr. Stearns go.
He's to my left. He's not normally on my left. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton, my friend from Texas, for 5 minutes.
I thank the distinguished gentleman from the windy city of Chicago, home of the Cubs and the White Sox. I appreciate that. I want to thank Chairman Rush and Chairman Waxman for convening this hearing today, and appreciate Ranking Member Whitfield and his leadership on this issue. I want to thank each of you witnesses for appearing before us today. I know it's a busy time for all of you. Since the Deepwater Horizon exploded and sank 3 months ago, this committee, in my opinion, has conducted a fair and rigorous investigation of the accident and developed what I consider to be a measured congressional response. Our Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Energy and Environment Subcommittee, Health Subcommittee, and now the Commerce, Trade, and Consumer Protection Subcommittee are each doing their best to review and discuss all of the issues surrounding the oil spill. As a result of these investigations and the bipartisanship engendered by them, the full committee recently voted 48-0 to report out a blowout prevention bill that, again, in my opinion, is a balanced response to the tragedy. I want to welcome all of you witnesses today to consider our investigation, continue the investigation. Especially want to welcome Mr. Ken Feinberg. Mr. Feinberg has competently administered the 911 Victims Compensation Fund. That was a very tough job, and I expect him to competently and transparently administer the current BP spill escrow account. The people of the Gulf Coast who have lost their jobs or had their livelihoods diminished by the oil spill should be compensated fairly, and should be compensated quickly. We're going to hear from some of the people who've been affected when we get to the other witnesses on this panel today. Tourism, fishing, and energy development are vital to the Gulf Coast, where they employ hundreds of thousands of people. The tourism industry, which is the focus of today's hearing, by itself generates over $30 billion a year. The oil spill reveals much about the Gulf Coast community. Many of us on this committee have come to know the strength of that community following the vast swath of destruction that was left by Hurricane Katrina nearly 5 years ago. Gulf Coast people are nothing if not resilient, but with this latest man-made disaster, some of those folks must be wondering what on earth is going to hit them next. The Gulf Coast economy is tied to earth and ocean resources. The industries along the Gulf are so intertwined that the losses in one sector ripple throughout the entire regional economy. That's why if we're going to understand the magnitude of the tragedy, we must listen closely to those who are being directly affected by the administration's decisions, especially the one currently to ban energy exploration. I've said this before, but the administration should reconsider its second moratorium decision. I think that's the wrong decision that they made. Enforcing a blanket pause in energy exploration is not unlike sending a new oil spill or a big storm to further threaten the jobs of the Gulf Coast. The administration has shown some tendency towards panic in this regards lately. This should not be a time for panic, but instead a time for careful, thoughtful consideration. I hope the administration will choose not to forget about the fishermen, shrimpers, rig workers who share the same uncertainty as those who work on the beaches, in the hotels, and along the retail establishments of the main streets of the Gulf Coast. This is an important hearing. Again, I want to thank the witnesses. I look forward to your testimony. And again, Mr. Chairman and Chairman and Ranking Member Whitfield, thank you for arranging this hearing. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Rush and Chairman Waxman and Mr. Whitfield for organizing this important hearing. You know, since April and the BP Deepwater Horizon blowout, Floridians have been living their worst nightmare. The environmental damage, the economic damage is taking a terrible toll on our small business owners, our hotels, our fishermen. You know, we were just coming out of the recession. So BP's disaster is wreaking havoc again on our hardworking folks in Florida. And what is particularly frustrating in the Tampa Bay area, where I represent, we've got the most beautiful beaches in the world, from Pinellas County, Manatee, Sarasota, all the way down to Sanibel Island. There's no oil there. The oil is hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And yet, the word has gone out all across the globe, especially to Europe and South America, where we rely on all those tourists, that the Florida beaches are damaged, that the Gulf Coast is toxic. We've got to turn that perception around. The efforts of BP to date have been inadequate, to say the least. What is particularly maddening is we watch these incessant ads, full-page ads by BP, that are polishing their corporate image at a time where they should be devoting a good portion of those monies to helping small business owners, our hotels, get back on their feet and explain to folks around the globe that our beaches are pristine and we want you to come to Florida. Rather than how many millions and millions and millions of dollars have they spent on polishing their own corporate image. Okay. So that's the frustration I wanted to share today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our expert witnesses. A special thank you to Keith Overton from the Trade Winds from St. Pete Beach, who is the head of Florida's Restaurant and Lodging Association. We have a lot to learn from all of you, and I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me also compliment you and Mr. Whitfield for your leadership on this hearing, and welcome Kenneth Feinberg, the Gulf Coast Claims Administrator here. He's going to have a tough job. I saw in the paper recently he said, I have a concern that BP is stalling claims. Yes, BP is stalling. I doubt they are stalling for money. It's not that. I just don't think they know the answer to the questions by the claimants. That's going to be true. Whether you decide a claim because of geographical distance or whether you decide a claim because of ownership, are you going to ask for tax returns? I mean, how are you possibly going to figure out what particular claim is valid or not? So we all pray and hope that he'll have the wisdom of Solomon to do this. I noticed in a report as of July 24th, in Florida, 41,818 claims were made, and money that was handed out was $45,320,000. So obviously, some claims have been paid, and a lot of people across many, many counties, and including counties that are not even affected by the Gulf Coast, have been paid. Florida has the most densely populated coastline in the United States, and so this spill threatens our beaches. And as a former restaurant and hotel owner, I deeply sympathize and empathize with these businesses and hope, obviously, that they're not hurt badly and that we can come back. But in the end, I think the hard questions for the administrator, Mr. Feinberg, is how to solve the questions of who gets the money and gets served with the extra support. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a very important hearing to hear from Mr. Feinberg and as well as the members of the tourist industry what they think should be done. So thank you.
Mr. Green of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like my colleagues, I want to welcome our panel, particularly Mr. Feinberg, but on a personal note, I'd like to welcome Mr. Brennan here. You reopened the Houston restaurant after a terrible fire, and we appreciate it in Houston. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for raising the issues of the effects of the oil spill on tourism in the Gulf of Mexico. having watched Jimmy Buffett's concert a few weeks ago from Gulf Shores, it's almost like we need that every week to get the word out along a number of different places on the Gulf Coast, because that was a good turnout. People saw the clean beaches and enjoying the music, so we need to do more of that. Along the Alabama to Texas Gulf Coast, oil and gas exploration, fishing, and tourism are the largest industries for employment and in economic progress. The oil spill has a profound impact on all three, and during one of our worst economic times in the last 70 years. I represent a district in Houston where thousands have lost or furloughed their jobs as a result of the drilling moratorium. Other areas have been hit even harder. In some Gulf Coast towns, oil and gas, fishing, and tourism are all they have, and now they don't have any of those three. I'm afraid this spill is going to have a lasting negative impact on communities beyond the environmental implications for years to come. With so much money being removed from the system, economies already hard hit will struggle to bounce back. It will be important for us to help those communities. One way this can be accomplished is by fixing misconceptions that lead the potential tourists to believe that the entire Gulf Coast has been marred and cannot be visited. Again, I see it all the time on the news. There are white beaches and the water is clean, so hopefully people who are watching this will know they can spend their vacation along the Gulf Coast. I'm pleased that our expert panel has given time today to be here, and I look forward to hearing. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. I yield back my time.
Mr. Latta is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Whitfield. I believe this is a very important hearing today as we examine the devastating impacts that the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster has had on the Gulf Coast tourism. I recently toured the area around Grand Isle, Louisiana, and saw firsthand the devastation of the region and its economic impact on the people who work and live there. This area of the country is one that relies heavily on its fishing and tourism industries, and I am looking forward to hearing from today's witnesses and their perspective on the disaster. I especially look forward to Mr. Feinberg's testimony and questions he may answer as to the administration's platform for the handling and distribution of the $20 billion escrow account to compensate victims of the oil spill. As disaster cleanup continues, we need to make sure funds are handled properly and in a timely manner, and they get to the appropriate individuals that need that assistance. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Sutton is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the distinguished chairman for holding this hearing. Over the last few months, we've heard from BP and other companies involved in the Deepwater Horizon disaster and administration officials about how this tragedy occurred and how we can prevent it from happening again. Now, at one of those early hearings, I asked Lamar McKay, the president and chairman of BP America, if BP would consider the loss of profits for fishing and tourism as a legitimate claim, and Mr. McKay replied yes. And that was a good development after BP's reckless actions. Their culture of carelessness caused the devastation of our waters and coasts and wildlife and injured countless businessmen and the tourism industry. And the losses to these businesses, of course, have had ripple effects throughout our economy. And we've heard some of that detailed here today, where people from places beyond the coast are feeling the effects of loss of tourism. I'm interested in hearing the testimony today from the witnesses about how the Gulf Coast Claims Facility has been processing the claims coming in and if this process can be improved. Thank you, and I yield back.
Dr. Gregory is recognized for 1 minute.
Chairman Rush, thank you for calling today's hearing on the impact that the Deepwater Horizon explosions had on tourism in the Gulf region. As a member of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation, I've had the opportunity to hear testimony on a range of matters relating to Deepwater Horizon. I look forward to hearing from today's panel of witnesses. Due to the importance that tourism has for the economy in the Gulf, it's critically important that we use today's hearing to assess the devastating impact that the oil spill will have on approximately 46% of the region's economy. At a time when unemployment across the country is 9.5%, further impact to the tourism industry in the region will only exacerbate those economic woes. Mr. Chairman, this downturn will not only affect the areas directly hit by the oil spill, but it will also affect areas where the coastline and water are still pristine. Therefore, we must strike a balance within the funds being handled by the Gulf Coast Claims Facility under Mr. Feinberg's administration. In particular, based on his earlier testimony at the Small Business Committee, I look forward to hearing from Mr. Feinberg in particular on the challenges facing the Gulf Coast tourism in the aftermath of Deepwater Horizon. And I thank all of you gentlemen who are actively involved in tourism industry. You know of what you speak. We look forward to hearing from you today. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Barrow of Georgia is recognized for 1 minute. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Scalise of the great state of Louisiana for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Whitfield, for having this important hearing on the oil spill's effect on tourism in the Gulf Coast. I want to start by welcoming a dear friend and a respected business leader from New Orleans, Ralph Brennan, not only respected in Louisiana, but as former head of the National Restaurant Association and authority on restaurants, tourism, and business, and I appreciate him coming and look forward to hearing his comments. And as my colleagues have pointed out, the tourism industry, including restaurants like Mr. Brennan's, is suffering from the effects of the oil spill, an industry that employs over 1 million people along the Gulf Coast and brings in approximately $39 billion in annual tax receipts, is now facing double-digit declines due to this disaster. A national survey done in May by the Louisiana Office of Tourism found that 26% of those who had plans to visit Louisiana had postponed or canceled their trip, while a June survey focused on nearby visitors along the Gulf Coast states found similar results. That is why it's so critical that the recovery fund being run by Mr. Feinberg is administered in a way that helps all of those that are being affected and will be affected by this disaster. And finally, Mr. Chairman, it's critical that the federal government does not add to the problems that we're facing along the Gulf Coast, and it's critical that the President end this irresponsible moratorium on offshore drilling. As people in Louisiana continue to fight the oil each day, President Obama and his administration are taking what is already a human and environmental tragedy and turning it into an economic tragedy by continuing to pursue this reckless moratorium. Mr. Chairman, the economy of my state and others along the Gulf Coast are already suffering. The federal government's role is to help and not hurt our recovery. I look forward to hearing from our panelists. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Gonzalez of Texas is recognized for 1 minute. Chair thanks the gentleman. Is there any other member? The chair does not see any other members seeking recognition. Now, the chair has a unanimous consent request before the committee, Mr. Millicent and Mr. Burgess, to sit on the panel and ask questions. I don't see either of them here. If in fact they do appear, then hearing no objection, if and when they do appear, they will be allowed to sit on the panel and ask questions of the witness. The chair also asks for unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from the Northwest Florida Tourist Development Council. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Now it is my pleasure and my privilege to recognize and introduce the witnesses that have appeared before us today. Beginning on my left, a name that is not unfamiliar with those who are here in this Congress, Mr. Kenneth Feinberg. He is the administrator for the Gulf Coast Claims Facility. He's on my far left. Seated next to him is Mr. Roger Dow, who's the president and CEO of the U.S. Travel Association. Seated next to Mr. Dow is Mr. Rip Daniels. He's the CEO and manager of WJZD-FM, and he's also the vice president of the Mississippi Gulf Coast Tourism Commission. Next to Mr. Daniels is Mr. Herb Malone. He's the president and CEO of the Alabama Gulf Coast Convention and Visitors Bureau. And seated next to Mr. Malone is Mr. Keith Overton. And Mr. Overton is the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Trade Winds Resort. And he's also the Chairman of the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association. And then we have Mr. Brennan, Mr. Ralph O'Brien, who is the president of the Ralph Brennan Restaurant Group, LLC. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing in response to our request and our invitation. It is the practice of this subcommittee to swear in witnesses, so I would ask if you would stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please be seated. Please let the record reflect that the witnesses have all in their entirety answered in the affirmative. And now we will recognize Mr. Feinberg for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify. It's the 4th time I've testified in the last 2 weeks in the Congress, 3 times on the House side and once on the Senate side. And I'm here again to answer any questions that the members may have. I am the independent administrator of this new Gulf Coast Claims Facility set up by agreement between the administration and BP. I do not work for the administration. I do not work for BP. I have been delegated the authority to design, implement, and administer this purely private facility funded by BP in a $20 billion escrow account. I have been assured by both the administration and BP that this facility that I am administering will, in fact, be totally independent. I answer to the people in the Gulf, not to the administration, nor to BP. BP is setting aside $20 billion in an escrow fund to pay all eligible claims that are submitted to the facility. Hopefully, the $20 billion will be enough. If not, BP has agreed that it will honor any additional financial obligations that it may have over and above the $20 billion. I am now in the process, as you know, of establishing this facility. It is not yet up and running. It will be up and running next month, in a few weeks, and will assume all responsibility from BP for processing private claims of individuals and businesses. I do not have any jurisdiction over government claims, state, local, or federal, none. I also have no jurisdiction over the moratorium claims for the rig workers, the $100 million set aside by BP for moratorium rig workers that is not part of the $20 billion and is being administered, as I understand it, separately. I want to give BP some credit. It has already paid over $230 million worth of claims, not out of the $20 billion, but as part of its petty cash. It's paid out $230 billion in individual and some business claims. When I said, Congressman Stearns, I think, reminded me about stalling. BP has not been paying certain problematic claims for the reasons really expressed by Congressman Stearns. I mean, what constitutes an eligible claim is a major question here, and it's going to be a major question today when it comes to tourism. It's easy to compensate a motel or a restaurant on the beach where there's oil. You don't need the wisdom of Solomon for that claim. You really don't. You don't need the wisdom of Solomon for a claim involving a motel on the beach where the beach is pristine but you can't fish. That's an easy claim. Proximity is going to be the problem here. Proximity. How far from the beach does a steakhouse that's lost 30% of its business because of a downswing in tourism? It's precisely the question posed by Congressman Stearns. What constitutes an eligible tourist claim? Now, I've got some great help on that from Mr. Malone from Alabama, who I've met with on a couple of occasions, who's thinking this problem through from the perspective of tourism in Alabama. Governor Chris in Florida has reminded me about the Panhandle and the influence of this disaster on the Florida coast. But what I'm going to have to decide, you see, as part of this Gulf Coast Claims Facility is what constitutes a direct claim that is immediately payable, and how far attenuated may a claim be from the spill. The overall impact of the spill undoubtedly impacts tourism throughout a particular state. I'm sure of that. The question is, what constitutes an eligible claim and what is required to be proven in advancing that calculation in order to get money from this facility? I'm as interested as the members are in hearing from my fellow witnesses today. Maybe I'll come up with some additional ideas that Mr. Malone has already advanced for my consideration in terms of trying to come up with a fair, equitable, just way to determine eligibility and to determine what the appropriate compensation should be. I look forward to the testimony of my other fellow witnesses. I look forward to working with this committee. There are some members here who I've already been working with over the past few weeks. I look forward to continuing to work with Congresswoman Castor and others, congressmen from Louisiana also. I've been meeting with them. I return to Florida tomorrow. I'll be in Mississippi and Alabama on Friday, and we'll be returning to Florida again and Louisiana in the next 2 weeks. So you can't do this from Washington. You have to spend a lot of time down there hearing what people have to say, the uncertainty, the concern, and I really look forward to working with this committee in the months and weeks ahead. Thank you.
Mr. Dow, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Whitfield and the members of the committee that are present. It's an honor to be here today, and I've already submitted and will submit my testimony for the record, but I'd like to be brief. To give you an idea, the U.S. Travel Association I represent is basically represents the whole $704 billion travel industry, where 1 in 9 Americans are employed. Our 2,000 members represent all the airlines, hotels, lodging companies, attractions, etc. And our mission is real simple, and that's to promote travel and increase travel to and within the United States that creates American jobs. During the current environmental crisis, that mission couldn't be more important. In my testimony, I'm going to highlight several things. One, the significance of the impact of travel and tourism, which you've already heard distinguished members of the panel, and also you will hear from the panel and also from the committee state, but also the potential long-term of the oil spill, the damages, and what BP and the federal government can do. It's mentioned that 4 states are impacted to the tune of $94 billion of their travel economy and a million employees in the travel economy. But you also have Texas, which perception has not been hit as hard, but perception can cause people not to go to parts of Texas, and that's even a bigger place. When you look at tourism, it has a much larger proportion in the Gulf region than in any other region in the country. 15% of private employees are in this industry in the Gulf region versus other areas. When you really look at how many people, the question is, who's harmed, as Mr. Feinberg said well, and how long, I think are very important questions. We commissioned Oxford Economics, one of the most respected economics firms in the globe, to take a look, because we've got to deal with facts, as Mr. Feinberg so rightly says, not hearsay. And we commissioned them to look at 25 national disasters around the world: hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, oil spills, pandemics, and take a look at what would happen and the facts of data and how long it took them to recover. Well, as you've already heard stated, Katrina, 5 years later, New Orleans hadn't recovered from pre-Katrina numbers. Oxford Economics estimates that the damage is going to be probably $22.7 billion. That's just to the travel and tourism industry over 3 years. What I want to talk about today is that cost can be reduced significantly by up to a third, or $7.6 billion. We have submitted the Oxford Economic Study, and we've also submitted a roadmap to recovery with concrete ideas how to mitigate the damages so we can lessen them for the taxpayers and lessen them for BP. Using travel to stimulate the economy and speed the recovery. And it's three parts. One is to inform the perception, and we all know how important perception is. Second, create an incentive for people to travel back to this area. Third, to make businesses and people whole. And this must be funded by BP to help reduce the long-term implications. A key lever that's available to BP and the federal government is the opportunity to create marketing to bring people back. We're asking that be considered a $500 million fund, which would give a 15-to-1 return, or $7.5 billion, to bring people back. Mr. Feinberg has the challenge of assessing real damages, but the challenge is left untouched, these damages will mount and will grow. We have an opportunity to shrink them, and we need to address that. And so with no guidance for recovery, we don't know how to submit the claim, so that is going to be important. We believe that the Gulf Coast Claims Facility is the right and only area to take $500 million and properly allocate it to the people that can make a difference. There's been many requests by states, and they've received, as you've already said, $70 million. The unfortunate problem is, of that $70 million, very little actually got to marketing. We'd like to remove the politics. We'd like to remove special interests. We'd like to get a transparent process where we can mitigate and pull this down. The damage has already occurred. Everyone's talking about capping the damages and capping the well. Well, we also need to cap the damages long term, and we can do that. The 400,000 people that work in this industry know how to do things in the industry. They probably don't know how to file a claim. So we need to get them back more quickly. A $500 million marketing effort will do that. We've seen that over and over. We saw that with SARS in Canada. We've watched for 98 days on television the problems. We can turn this around. We can mitigate it. Nothing is more important than getting a fund to do this, to put it in place, and I believe that will help the communities, the families, and the taxpayers, and in the long term, reduce the liability for BP. Thank you very much.
The chair recognizes now Mr. Daniels for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rush, Ranking Member Whitfield, and other subcommittee members. I'm representing myself today.
Would you turn the mic on and put it close to you? Thank you.
Apologize for that. I'm representing myself as a private citizen and not the Harrison County Tourism Commission, primarily because I wanted to represent small business as well as it applies to tourism. I've been in tourism since 1978, starting as a tavern owner, radio broadcaster, real estate broker, tourism commissioner, and the primary investor in the coast's newest African-American hotel, the Almanet. I've seen firsthand the adverse effects of a range of disasters, from Hurricane Camille's destruction on the seafood industry's processing in 1969 to the economic recession of the 80s, which resulted in the closing of the Hilton and Sheraton hotels, the complete destruction of the coast tourism destination by Hurricane Katrina. However, I've also been a part of the recovery and renewal of the coast after each calamity. And the resilience of the Gulf Coastians in the face of insurmountable destruction is a testament to their faith in God and in each other. On the eve of the 5-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, the coast was poised to have a banner year for tourism. On April 20th, the Deepwater Horizon sunk, and so did our hopes to finally reestablish the Mississippi Gulf Coast as a tourist destination as opposed to a hurricane-ravaged resort. The impact of the BP oil disaster on tourism has been and will be a disaster. The devastation is difficult to measure because both the actual damage and the perception of the damage cannot be readily measured. Was the Gulf Coast spared because there was a limited amount of oil to reach the shoreline, or was the shoreline spared because most of the oil is still at the bottom of the Gulf, or dispersed in plumes? Is the perception of clean beaches better than the perception of clean seafood? In the words of my grandson, is it safe to go in the water? And if not, is it safe to eat the fish? One can glean that the Mississippi Gulf Coast billion-dollar tourism industry is indelibly tied to seafood. According to recent Harrison County surveys, the #1 reason for visiting the Mississippi Gulf Coast was the food, the seafood. Ladies and gentlemen, the coastal view is still gorgeous. The beaches are clean, the sound and the bayous are open for fishing, but the seafood, is it safe? How does the coast remove the perception that it's not? Surprisingly, according to the Hotel Motel Association and the Casino Association, hotel stays over the last 90 days have been up, and casino revenues have been up. But of course, that is compared to last year when the tourism economy was at an all-time low. Yet, maybe the fact that the Harrison County Tourism Commission, under my guidance, investing $650 billion in advertising, did help at least with drive-in markets. Hotel Motel Association stats have shown that many of the room nights are as a result of extended stay, BP employees, government agencies, media, petroleum cleanup-related businesses, and the like. Although there is a perception at times that the Gulf Coast revenue is up, is it the result of tourism, or is it a result of oil recovery? And if so, does that not suggest that the recovery is not over until tourism is back to the ratio that existed prior to the explosion? The most serious adverse effect over the lack of tourism, not recovery workers, is that many of the mom and pop shops, the restaurants, off-boat seafood merchants, water sports vendors, and golf courses and the like have suffered. They are not getting tourist dollars, which were far greater. And then even more importantly, we have noticed that inquiries about future visits to the coast as it applies to tourism is off 40 to 50%. What happens when all the recovery money is gone and all the workers are gone? Ironically, just as the Deepwater Horizon was an exploratory mission, Mississippi Gulf Coast now finds itself challenged with the exploration of what to do in the coming years to fight the perception. There's too many unknowns right now. Considering the fact that we just had a bunny, one has to wonder just what will happen when there is another Katrina or another hurricane, and just how many tar balls will be washed up. Ladies and gentlemen, on the Mississippi Gulf Coast as it applies to tourism, we are not enthusiastic about trading a billion-dollar seafood industry for a $1 million well. So we would hope, and in my testimony, you will see some recommendations and hopefully some cures for this ill. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Malone for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, and thank the members of the subcommittee for inviting us here today. It's a tremendous honor to represent our area. It's an honor to represent the some 2,000.
The mic to you. Thank you.
Okay. It's an honor to represent some 2,000 business owners and some 40,000 employees that they employ, whose livelihoods all are at risk as we sit here today. Our area began receiving oil on our beach in mid-May. We've continued to receive it, have some sheen offshore coming ashore today as we speak. This is our high season. With the oil impacts we've had, I cannot describe it verbally as well as it should be. Many of us have had problems with the media and the way the media has overstated things, which sometimes they tend to do. But I'll tell you honestly, when the media in the second week of June reported that the beaches of Alabama were slathered with oil, we were slathered with oil. It was not a false report. They failed to report how much has been cleaned up. Our beaches do look good today, and there is a cleanup process. It took a while to get it working, but it is working. What has this done to our tourism economy? It's destroyed it. We're devastated. We should be at 85 to 90% occupancy today in mid-July and late July. We're running less than 30%. And when occupancy goes down, rates go down even greater. So our revenue to our lodging, to our restaurants, to everyone in town, I don't know of a single business, and I conveyed this to Mr. Feinberg in a recent meeting, I don't know of a single business in our town that has not been directly affected by this oil. It has created a sense of despair that I've never seen. Like Mr. Daniels, I've grown up on the Gulf Coast. I've been through hurricanes. We've been through hurricanes. I've been in this position for 22 years. I look at the eyes of my friends and colleagues around the community, and I see despair I've never seen before. We've mentioned and remember the 11 victims of the explosion of the rig. We've had a 12th victim. We've had a charter boat captain, Captain Alan Cruz, who in the sense of despair, beyond hope, took his own life. We hope that's the last one. We have measures in place to try to prevent that from happening again. We hope we're successful with those. We're the smallest beach, laterally we're the smallest beach on the Gulf Coast. We have the least amount of coastline of any of the 5 states. But we generate $2.3 billion annually from our tourism product. With the decline that we see in this high season, we fully expect our loss to be at or near $1 billion just this year, not counting what happens in the in the future years. And that is the direct spending by the consumer, not counting the ripple effect as it would have rippled through our economy. So it is devastating to us. It is about survival. The BP claims process has been mentioned, and the numbers that they seem to tout quite often of what they have paid, the bigger numbers what they have not paid. Last night I received an email from one of our local CPA firms that I know has been very actively engaged in the claims process. They have gave me a detailed list of over 70 claims they have filed on behalf of businesses. These 70 claims total over $27 million. This is just for May and June. July claims are just now starting to be filed. Of that $27 million, less than $5 million has been paid yet to owners. Of that $5 million, $3.5 million went to 2 claims. So as you see, there's a tremendous void in what's been filed and what's been requested and what's been documented. And this CPA firm is highly reputable. They've been actively engaged from the very beginning, and they, like the rest of us, are very frustrated why money is not coming into the hands of our business community. Without that, they can't support the jobs. They can't make payroll next week. They can't pay the notes that are due. Our industry is much like farmers. We prepare in the spring, we market, we spruce up the place, we paint the boat, we remodel during the winter, we're ready for the coming season. And just like a farmer who's lost his crop, we've lost our yield. So not only is it a terrible time in regard to the recession and the previous hurricanes, it's a terrible time of year for us. So our request to you today, as this committee, a subcommittee, and members of Congress, is to do, please, whatever you can to get money in the hands of Mr. Feinberg and his program and get it up and going as fast as possible. We have had 2 meetings with Mr. Feinberg. We found him to be very fair and open-minded. Our first meeting, he scared us with his eligibility requirements. But in our second meeting, he listened to our side of the case, and he said we've closed the gap tremendously with him. We still have some work to do, Mr. Feinberg, but we're feeling better about it. And we look forward to working with him. But our problem is I have businesses who have banknotes due last week. Every day that goes by is critical. Every week that goes by, there'll be another foreclosure. So when Mr. Feinberg says he's taking over mid-next month, ideally for us, he would take over tomorrow. And if there is any way that members of this committee or any other members of Congress can help facilitate getting this in the control of Mr. Feinberg and out of the control of BP, it would be a tremendous benefit to us. With that, I would like to close other than to say that, again, thank you for your interest in this issue. Thank you to the gentleman who recognized our Jimmy Buffett concert. Thank you to the lady from Florida who discussed beautiful beaches. We share the same beautiful beaches with Florida, at least we did before the oil. We look forward to the day those beaches are beautiful once again.
Thank you. Mr. Overton, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished subcommittee members. For the record, we too are a little frightened of Mr. Feinberg so far, but I think we're going to get through it okay as we have more discussion. Florida is the vacation capital of the country, and it has been for generations. When visitors think of Florida, they envision warm sunshine, blue waters, sugary white sand beaches, fresh seafood, and a natural environment like no other. All of these wonderful characteristics have been damaged as a result of the perceptions that Florida's beaches are covered in oil. Tourism is big business. It's our #1 industry. We hosted over 80 million visitors in 2009. We captured nearly 17 vacations from Floridians, 17 million vacations from Floridians. Collectively, our visitors spent over $60 billion on travel last year, generating nearly $4 billion in sales tax collections. What that means is more than 1/5 of Florida sales tax dollars are paid by visitors, and it also means jobs. Nearly 1 million Floridians are directly employed in travel and tourism. To give you an example of the economic impact the BP oil spill is having on hotels, let me give you some statistics from my hotel, the Tradewinds. For purposes of geographic reference, we are the largest resort on the west coast of Florida, just west of Tampa Bay, located in Pinellas County. Call volume is down by as much as 25%. We have 800 of the county's approximate 35,000 hotel rooms. So when you take an average of the last 3 years, which is what BP is asking us for, of our revenue shortfalls, and you compare that to the revenue that we have achieved since the oil spill, we're down approximately $1.7 million. Now, if you extrapolate that out and you assume the balance of Pinellas County's 35,000 rooms have had a similar impact, that's a $70 million economic loss just in hotel room revenue, and that doesn't include restaurants or secondary businesses related to tourism. And then if you think about the Panhandle, which has 76,000 hotel rooms in its entirety, and the effects clearly have been more devastating to them than they have in Pinellas County, it's easy to see that the losses to Florida's tourism are in the billions. It's a substantial number, and it's something that we want to make on the record today that we need help with that. What's most concerning to me is that all of these losses have occurred to our resorts without a drop of oil being on any beach in Pinellas County. It's amazing to me how the perceptions of the media have gotten us to this point. Nonetheless, we're there. I also want to share with you that the Y Partnership conducted a survey on June 18th, and it was asked at the time of the participants, which states do you believe will most directly be impacted by oil? 95% of them put Florida at the top of the list. Florida is clearly the least affected state, at least physically, from the oil that's impacted the shoreline. So clearly, again, I want to restate this as a perception problem. And I certainly think we can all agree that perceptions have worsened since June 18th. Prior to appearing on a Neil Cavuto show a couple weeks ago, I was viewing a monitor, and it had the president who was appearing in Pensacola Beach. And at the time, there were a few tar balls there, but it hadn't been materially affected. And the ticker tape along the bottom, I couldn't hear what was being said, but it read, "Oil finally reaches Florida's beaches, plural." And when they transitioned to the next shot, the television station, I can't recall which one it was, superimposed the oil running down the screen behind the president over the beautiful Gulf waters that were behind him. And I said to myself, you know, 25 million, 50 million, 100 million, there's no amount of money that's going to combat that kind of imagery. And it's a challenge that we're faced with, and it's going to be there for many, many years to come, I believe. Much like what happened in the hurricanes of 2004. We're still suffering from that and cannot gain occupancies in August and September that we used to achieve. I have 5 requests of the committee in closing, if you would acknowledge them, and I would ask you to at least address them in your comments and your questions. One is the media must be held accountable to accurate and fair reporting of the facts regarding this oil spill. They have a legal and an ethical responsibility to do so, yet many of them continue to put ratings ahead of accuracy. I urge you to charge some agency, maybe it's this governing body, I'm not sure, within the federal government to review news reports weekly and hold them accountable for the sensationalism and the inaccuracies that are there. We need somebody to support us in that regard, or it will just continue on even with the next crisis beyond this one. Number 2, we're optimistic that the oil leak has been capped. However, there's still going to be years of cleanup and recovery efforts remaining. We all fear that the claims are going to cease being paid prior to the end of the actual losses. I think that's an accepted concept today. Additionally, Mr. Feinberg's recent comments with regards to what is a compensable or legitimate claim based on whether or not oil is on its beaches and the proximity to that oil is also very concerning to all of our members and all the tourist-based businesses within Florida. And we implore Mr. Feinberg and any branch of the government that can influence the claim process to look very carefully at this and not allow it to be a black and white issue. We want to make sure each business owner has an opportunity to be heard for their legitimacy of their claims and not just ruled out because of geographics. Third, I'd like to make you aware that the CVBs in all of the Gulf Coast counties rely on bed tax dollars, and those bed tax dollars are related to hotel room revenues. When they fall, revenues fall, then the bed tax dollars fall. We need that marketing money. We need to be made whole. I know that's not Mr. Feinberg's responsibility, but those CVBs need to be made whole on the dollars that have been lost for their marketing purposes. The fishing and seafood industry and our wildlife are critical to tourism in Florida's economy. I'm not going to go into the details, but I've included in your packet some recommendations from very legitimate Ocean Conservancy, other agencies that will help you in some of your studies as it relates to our wildlife. And lastly, we have to continue to spend money on marketing efforts, both domestically and internationally. We have not yet gotten more money past the $25 million originally that BP has given to us. $50 million was requested by our governor, and it's been turned down. We really need that money. It's very important. This is going to go on for a long period of time, as I said earlier, and those dollars are vital to our recovery. I thank you very much for allowing me to speak today and giving you our testimony.
Mr. Brennan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And sorry about that. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the National Restaurant Association and the restaurant industry. As you said in my introduction, I'm from the Ralph Brennan Restaurant Group, and I've been involved in the restaurant industry in New Orleans for almost 30 years. And my family's been in the restaurant business for more than 60 years, and as a group we operate 12 restaurants, 9 of those in New Orleans. And Gulf seafood is an important ingredient in all of our menus. I want to thank you for holding this hearing and for your continuous focus on the oil spill's impact on the economy of the Gulf region and the nation, and I appreciate the opportunity to tell the restaurant industry's part of the story. Ours is an industry that employs an estimated 2.3 million employees in the Gulf Coast region. Restaurants in the Gulf Coast area generate about $77 billion in annual sales. Since April 20th, when oil began flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, our coastline, our sea life, our culture, and our tourism economy are again in great jeopardy. After Hurricane Katrina roared ashore on August the 29th, 2005, Gulf Coast residents and businesses essentially knew what to do to return to normal, or as we call it today, the new normal. The water came into New Orleans, the water went out, and we began to rebuild and move on. But this is not the case today. The key message that I want to share with you is one of long-term uncertainty, impacting both the ecosystem of the Gulf and the economy of the Gulf Coast area, and potentially devastating tourism in the Gulf states. Across the affected areas, restaurants report a range of experiences. Those located in seaside or in beach communities are decimated as tourism shrivels. Tourists are not coming because there is either oil on the beach or in the water, or people have the perception that there is oil there. And visitor perception is key to decisions about where to vacation. The overall numbers of tourists are down, restaurant guests and sales are decreasing, product costs are increasing, and jobs are in jeopardy as already thin margins precariously slip away. In New Orleans, one of the driving forces of our economy is culinary tourism, and Gulf seafood is at the heart of our culinary tourism. Like we saw after Hurricane Katrina, convention groups and leisure travelers are now calling to express concern about upcoming business and whether to book future business. Many are asking if oil is on the doorsteps in New Orleans, and New Orleans is miles inland. Today, almost 5 years after Hurricane Katrina, convention bookings have not returned to pre-Katrina levels because of the damage to the New Orleans brand, and the oil spill risks surrendering the ground that we've gained over the last few years, along with future increases. While the focus of my testimony is not primarily on the BP claims process, I have heard from some of our Restaurant Association executives along the Gulf that there's a willingness to set up a claims center, and that would be solely focused on the restaurant and hotel industries, and I want to voice my strong support for that idea. Regarding my 3 New Orleans restaurants specifically, sales are down, counts are down, costs are up, and margins are down, and this is not a sustainable business model. And as the oil looms offshore with an impact that could last for many years to come. With regard to perceptions and misconceptions, I'd like to begin applauding our state and federal officials for the stringent safety testing of Gulf seafood that has allowed truthful reporting around the potential toxicity of the seafood. But we are fortunate that 100% of the reports to date have shown that Gulf seafoods to be safe to consume from areas that are approved. Ongoing testing is crucial for a safe and informed public. Despite the testing concerns about safety and supply, one of the recent national polls indicated that 54% of the respondents said they would only eat seafood that they know does not come from the Gulf. Our staff has received many calls and comments, all centering around safety and supply. And to combat concerns, we have aggressively trained our staff to knowledgeably share precise locations of where our seafood comes from. To demonstrate support for the fishermen and the safety of the product, my restaurants have added seafood offerings. As I told the New York Times, the way to help is to eat Gulf seafood. If high-profile individuals, including celebrities, celebrity chefs, and even members of Congress, could be seen eating a Gulf shrimp po' boy, it would go a long way to alleviating consumer fear. The Obama family's visit to Florida beaches next month is a welcome opportunity, again, for positive reinforcement. And I know the National Restaurant Association is looking to plan some of its meetings in the Gulf Coast region, and I would hope that trade associations and even government agencies would do the same. Despite a curb in the demand for Gulf seafood, prices across the board have increased. On average, in my restaurants, we're paying 18 to 30% more for the seafood that we serve. Finally, I'd like to comment on the long-term impact of a misinformed public. In the years after Hurricane Katrina, potential visitors from around the country thought that the city of New Orleans was still underwater, that the drinking water was unsafe, and there were no hospitals or other city services. These misperceptions were largely created and reinforced by the media because of the regular replaying of images from days after the storm. Many in New Orleans feel it was only after the New Orleans Saints and the city of New Orleans hosted 2 playoff games back in January, and the Saints went on to win the Super Bowl, that those misperceptions were finally ceased. Misperceptions are happening again now. Just about every day, a story is reported live from New Orleans on the spill. The perception shaped by the media, even if unintentional, is that oil is on the doorsteps of New Orleans. That's sensationalistic and untrue. Yet if reporting from these locales continues, the public will continue to draw its own conclusions and perceive New Orleans and many of the cities and resorts across the Gulf as damaged destinations. Marketing dollars will be needed to counter these misperceptions. The long-term consequences and impact on tourism of a damaged brand are severe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, for this opportunity to be here today.
The chair thanks all the witnesses for their fine testimony, and the chair recognizes himself now for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning the witnesses. Mr. Feinberg, I'm going to begin with you. At this moment, BP is still processing claims, I understand, filed by businesses and workers in the Gulf Coast region. According to your testimony, BP has already paid $200 million in emergency payments. Despite these numbers, we've been told as a committee that there are many complaints about the claims process that BP is utilizing. Mr. Malone describes the process as erratic, somewhat convoluted, and at times dysfunctional. And also in your testimony, you stated how complicated it is to determine whether the oil spill is true or the approximate cause for the damages that businesses are suffering, even when there is no evidence of oil in sight. Many of these businesses are on life support as they wait a determination of their eligibility to submit a claim against the $20 billion escrow fund that BP has established. And Mr. Feinberg, I just have to ask you, because I'm drawn to the infamous and fictional Gulf Coast fisherman Forrest Gump said that life is a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get. Now, my question to you is, when will the people of the Gulf Coast, the business people, the workers, when will they get definite answers? Mr. Dow talked about a roadmap to recovery. When will they get something specific from you or someone else about who's eligible, why they're eligible, when they're going to get paid, how much they're going to get paid? These are just some basic questions. The guesswork needs to end now. It needs to come to a switching out, the guesswork. And so your process that you're going through, I understand you got to go through this process, go through a process in terms of getting to a point of answering some of these very, very valid and important questions. But when is the process going to be over? When are you going to be able to give some clarity and eliminate the guesswork?
I'll answer that very obviously critically important question with 3 answers. First, I believe that the blueprint that I have established for emergency payments to be paid as quickly as possible should be finished and available this week. That's first. That's my goal. Secondly, I have no authority to fund the $20 billion escrow account. That is an agreement between the administration and BP. My understanding is that they are working overtime to try and finalize the terms and conditions of that escrow account, which will make the $20 billion available. I can't give you a time except to say I think it's probably within a matter of weeks, but I don't know. I'm not privy to that escrow negotiation. Third, I suspect that I'll be able to accept transition from BP. BP will get out of the claims business completely, the private claims business, and I should be up and running with the Gulf Coast Claims Facility the middle of next month. The middle of next month, a couple of weeks. And then I will assume all authority to process emergency claims in which the fisherman, the small business, the restaurant will not waive any rights they may have. They will simply decide if they're eligible, they'll decide whether they want to participate in the program, and will receive, if eligible, and if they document their loss, up to 6 months of emergency payments to help get them over this immediate emergency. Now Mr. Chairman, if I may just add, I understand from all of these witnesses and from the members of this committee, time is of the essence. This is a huge undertaking. And I am working as fast as I can, as diligently as I can, full time, to get the Gulf Coast Claims Facility up and running, to get it funded, so that these emergency claims can be made as soon as possible.
What are you considering the workers also in terms of, will they be, the same guidelines apply to them also?
The same. I think BP, frankly, has done a much better job of this $230 million they've paid out. I think they've done a much better job of paying out worker claims, shrimpmen, fishermen, oyster harvesters, than they have paying out small business and large business claims. I think that's clear from the testimony I've heard today and from the CPA in Alabama, and I think that's absolutely true. That's one reason why I've got to get up and running with this facility as soon as I can.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Whitfield, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you again for your testimony, and Mr. Feinberg, I think all of us are delighted that you will truly be independent. You're not reporting to anyone. I think that's probably good for all of us to get a fair and equitable help on this problem. I noticed that Mr. Daniels, Mr. Overton, and Mr. Brennan in their testimony placed a great deal of emphasis on damages caused by perception as opposed to damages caused by actual damage. And I've heard many people also blame the media for assisting in this misperception of the American public. And I don't think any of us are surprised by that, because the media is focused on being sensational and obtaining more viewers and more readers, and frequently without any regard to the real impact it has on people. But my question to you would be, since you're going to be up and running within a month, hopefully, when you start processing claims, from your perspective, it won't make any difference if the damage is caused by perception or by actual damages. Is that correct?
That is correct. Under the law of the Federal Pollution Control Act, which is a very important aspect of this whole process, actual physical damage to property is not required. So the issue for me, you're absolutely right on, Congressman. The issue for me is not whether perception that has an impact on tourism is compensable. The question really is going to be how far removed is a claim to be eligible. It's one thing if the perception harms a motel on the beach, even if there's no damage. It's another thing if the perception harms a motel 70 miles inland.
Right.
And I've got to decide. I take no advanced position on this, but that is where I think that's what Congressman Stearns was getting at a little bit, where you draw that line on eligibility.
And that's going to be one of the obviously key points that you're going to have to decide on. It kind of reminds you of the old Paulsgraf case in torts in law school.
You remember. That's right.
But on the, Mr. Dow, you talked about a $500 million fund to assist. Now, would this money, is it your idea that this money for emergency marketing would also come from BP?
Yes, I definitely believe it should come from BP, and the question whether it can come from this fund or an additional amount, but as I stated, I hope clearly is that this can mitigate the damages phenomenally to the tune of $7 to $8 billion. Just as all the money was spent to cap that well, we ought to cap the damages now. No one would say, let the oil run forever and let's just pay the people afterwards for their damages. They said, stop it, and we have to do the same thing. So I believe it should come from BP. Mr. Feinberg is maybe between a rock and a hard place of can that money come from the
Do you have authority to pay out money for marketing?
I don't think, I'm not privy to that negotiation involving the escrow account, but I don't think under the terms of that escrow account, $500 million for marketing could come out of that $20 billion. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other sources for it, but I don't think, I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think it could come out of the $20 billion.
If I come in for emergency payment from you and you give me emergency funds, will I be required to sign a release for legal liability issues?
No.
Will I ever be required to sign a legal release?
You'll be required to sign a release down the road only if you come back to the facility and seek a final payment for all of your then damage and projected future damage. Okay. Only then would you have to sign a release, not as part of these emergency funds.
Thank you.
Ms. Caston is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dow, since the April BP blowout in the Gulf, have you seen these TV ads that BP has been running, polishing their corporate image?
If you own a television set, you cannot not see them. I have seen them, and I've seen them, and it just points out to me the very clarity that BP truly understands that changing perception and getting the word out is critical. I think the same thing has to be done for the citizens, for the businesses of the Gulf Coast. It is critical, and it can stem the damages phenomenally.
I think you're right. I think you said it well. If you own a TV, you've seen these incessant ads by BP. Oftentimes not very informative, just they remind me of political campaign ads, frankly. And you can't pick up a newspaper. Mr. Malone, I'm sure you're seeing in Alabama what we see in Florida. Is there a day you pick up the newspaper, you don't see these full-page ads?
That's true, and I can tell you that we have met with some of the BP officials that you see in those ads, particularly the gentleman that represents, he's in charge of claims for BP. We met as early as May 11th in my office with our mayors and other leading people, some of our CPAs, in a proactive approach to try to establish an expedited claims process. Lots of promises were made that day on May 11th. I don't mean to be flippant, but in our community, BP has come to stand for a broken promise. And that's what we've seen one after another after another. In fact, they issued a press release around the middle of June where they said they had adopted an expedited claims process for business claims. I read your figures a while ago. It's not come true. Now, Mr. Feinberg's right. The individual employee can walk in a claims office and walk out with a check for $2,500 or $5,000 if he's got his W-9s from last year or whatever, with minimum documentation. But when you ask a business to submit 2,200 pages of documentation before your claim would even be considered, that's onerous. And that same business submitted their claim in May, mid-May, has yet to receive more than 10% of the claims they've presented since May to this date. These claims, they refer to as large claims. They differ on whether that's over 20,000, over 50,000, depending on who you talk to. They are sent to a forensic accountant for examination before they're ever given consideration. That takes weeks and weeks to do. As I said in my written comments, to me, it's the analogy of everyone submitting their income tax returns. And if you do a refund, you can't get your refund until a full audit is completed. They're doing a full audit before they're writing a single check to our businesses. And I'm not always talking about the million-dollar businesses. The guy who rents beach umbrellas on the beach, submits $60,000 claims. That's his whole year.
Don't you think it's making folks mad because they understand how much this media campaign is costing BP? I mean, do you see the same thing in Mississippi, Mr. Daniels? You see all these ads and TV commercials?
Yes, without a doubt we do. And actually, as a broadcaster, we sell advertisement to BP. That's the paradox here. From a broadcasting standpoint, it's not necessarily the ads, it's the reassurance. And if the federal government would do one thing, that is reassure by way of Mr. Feinberg's claims, but especially when it comes down to saying that the seafood is safe. What the rest of the world needs to hear, and especially the nation needs to hear, is that it's okay to go in the water and that it is safe and that it's being monitored.
Right.
I came up with...
I know someone had made an inquiry of BP about how much money they have spent on these ads, and they refused to provide that information. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that this committee seek from BP the amount of money that they have spent on their corporate image polishing campaign since the BP blowout.
Well, the chair will, considering the lady's request, I think we'll direct staff to address a letter to BP specifically with that question in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And quickly, in my remaining time, Mr. Feinberg, we've got to be able to bring our local government and CVB industry state claims as part of your $20 billion escrow. How do we do this? Do we need to lobby the administration and BP to have that included in this escrow agreement that is going to be coming out in the next week or two?
First of all, the government claims are included in the $20 billion escrow. They're just not part of my watch. Out of that $20 billion will come not only the claims that I pay, but all government claims will come out of that $20 billion. But the way the understanding was reached between the administration and BP, government claims are the direct responsibility of BP, even though they're coming out of the $20 billion.
But what's your opinion? Don't you agree that you and your experts are competent, in fact, expert enough to sort through those very difficult and detailed claims?
If it's the will of the parties to the agreement, the administration and BP, I'm glad to
so it's up to them.
Take on that as if I don't have enough problems, but I'd be glad to take on that assignment. But again, not on my watch at the current time, nor the moratorium claims either.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Barton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of my questions are going to be towards Mr. Feinberg simply because he's got a huge undertaking and we don't get him before our committee too often. But I want to tell you other gentlemen, I listened to your testimony in my office. I clearly understand the issues that you're dealing with and clearly support that you should be compensated. I'm especially pleased to know that there's still a Brennan involved with Brennan's. That's comforting to know since I'm a frequent visitor to your restaurants when I'm in New Orleans. My first question to you, Mr. Feinberg, and let me say, I do support that there be a compensation fund. I do support that BP pays most, if not all, of the money that goes into that fund, and I do support that it be, as I said, fairly, quickly, and transparently paid out to the people that have the claims. My first question to you, Mr. Feinberg, is who do you report to? Do you report to the President? Do you report to the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve? Who exactly is your boss?
I don't have a boss on this assignment. I think the fair answer, Congressman, would be that I report to the people in the Gulf. Both the administration and BP, frankly, don't want to get near me once this program is up and running, and they want to reinforce the notion I'm totally independent.
You did an excellent job in the other fund that you administered, but that was different. That fund was approved by the Congress. There were clear reporting standards. This isn't a unique fund.
It really is.
There apparently is no precedent for it. Doesn't mean, again, that we don't need it, but if my understanding is correct, now that you've been either asked to serve or appointed by the President, he does not have the power to remove you. Is that correct?
I think that I think that clearly is correct. Clearly, he doesn't have the power.
All right. Do you have to personally approve each claim to be paid?
As a theoretical matter, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Now, of course, there's going to be thousands of claims, and I'm going to have a process in place, an infrastructure, where problematic claims will come to me. Hopefully, we'll consistently apply the formulas, and there won't be a necessity for me to look at each and every claim.
When a claim is paid, will your signature be on the check?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question.
All right.
That's a good
Where will
question.
the funds be deposited that you allocate? Will they deposit in the U.S. Treasury in Washington, in a branch office of the Federal Reserve, in a private financial institution or institutions?
One, I don't know the answer to that question because I'm not privy to the escrow negotiations between the administration and BP. Two, I have urged both of the escrow negotiators to deposit at least some of the money in local regional institutions in the Gulf that have expressed a real desire to benefit financially from this.
Who makes the decision what depository institution is to be used?
Again, that would be between the administration and the fellow in the administration that I've been consulting with is Tom Pirelli, the Associate Attorney General, and at BP.
But you have no definitive role in making that decision?
None.
You're purely make the decision what the protocol is for claims, the claims process, and the decision-making protocol for making decisions on the claims, and then being sure that there's adequate follow-up and documentation. Is that a fair statement?
That is correct, and I want to make sure the checks don't bounce, but yeah, that is absolutely accurate.
Okay. What reporting requirement, if any, does the fund that you're going to oversee have to report to the Congress on the dispersion and operation of the fund?
There will be expressed reporting requirements that all interested parties, starting with the Congress, will have information, whether it's monthly or biannually, frequent reporting as to how the claims are being processed, what the statistics show, our claim rate, etc.
What transparency will there be for the public, i.e., will there be a public website that shows claims paid and who received the money, and perhaps even pending claims and the decision process by which a decision is made on a claim?
Yes. Now, we've got to be careful, as we were with the 9/11 fund, that we don't disclose under the umbrella of transparency individual names or private information, proprietary business information, but I'm completely in agreement with you, Congressman, in your question, that we've got to have a transparent database from which people can review how we're doing and what our strengths and weaknesses have been.
I have one more question, Mr. Chairman. I know that my time has expired. You, in answer to the young lady from Florida's question, you indicated that other decision makers will have decision-making authority over this $20 billion fund, and that your authority is going to be restricted to certain disbursements. Do you make decisions on compensation for oil and gas workers who've lost their jobs?
Yes. Not the moratorium rig workers, though.
I understand that. For fishermen,
yes,
and seafood, food
all
processing.
individuals, all private businesses, no government claims.
Okay, so the government claims the decision maker is
BP.
Well, I wouldn't think we would allocate to them what government official would oversee their decision.
No, I mean, I think the government official will send a claim for reimbursement, for cleanup, or for lost tax revenue or whatever to BP for processing. That's currently the plan.
Mr. Chairman, will we have the ability to ask written questions for responses from the panel?
Chair, we'll address that issue once
I know my time's expired, and I appreciate the chair's consideration. I thank you for your answers, Mr. Fine.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Chakowski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses. You know, I was listening to and looking through all the testimony here, and I think that it would be good for example, for Mr. Daniels' questions. He asked a number of questions to be included among those that we present as our own questions. I think they're very important, and that he deserves those answers, and so that we should include that in the questions.
Those will be included in the written questions that we would submit to the witnesses.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask about the suggestion, I think it was Mr. Dow's suggestion, that the government incentivize do an incentive for people to do tourism in the region. Was that you or Mr. Malone?
It was me. It was part of 3 points of $500 million to get the perception, get the right information out, and incentivize people.
Well, exactly what does that mean? What does incentivize?
There's several things that can be done. They've been done in the past. The Commerce Department runs trade missions. There could be incentives where they don't charge for those missions to get more people here. There's opportunities to give meal tax deductions, or some tax things have done. There's many things that have been done in the past throughout areas that will give people an advantage by going to an area and an incentive to do so. And we've got a list of them in that roadmap for recovery, ma'am.
Thank you. And I think, Mr. Feinberg, you may have answered this, but Mr. Malone said that he's personally spoken with a large number of business owners who have yet to see a single payment, particularly the larger ones. Are you suggesting that they refile when you're up and running, or no?
They won't have to refile at all. We will assume responsibility for those claims and accelerate them as quickly as possible. As Mr. Malone has pointed out to me, and Governor Riley in Alabama has pointed out, we don't want to reinvent the wheel by requiring people to refile.
Okay. Mr. Feinberg, Mr. Overton was talking about the damage that has been done, even though there's no oil at all. That's still true at his resort. This is clearly on the water, and so is his business eligible then for compensation from the fund?
His business is eligible insofar as he has a claim where there's been no visible damage to the beach. He would have that's not the issue in that case. What I don't know from that statement is how close is his business to the beach, How dependent is it on the beach or fishing or sightseeing or charter boats or what have you? So it is the facts surrounding the overall claim that are going to be critical in deciding eligibility in something like that.
Yeah. This perception question is really hard to get your arms around, but may be the biggest source of damage long-term. Am I right, Mr. Brennan? Did you want to comment on that?
Well, no, I think the best example is to look at Hurricane Katrina and the impact on New Orleans, the perception of the city as a damaged brand. And I think you as a member of Congress understand perception, and we have to overcome that. And just like BP is running these ads trying to change the perception of their company, we need to do a similar thing to change the perception of the hospitality and tourism industries along the Gulf Coast.
Whose responsibility do you think, Mr. Feinberg, or is it everybody's, to proactively address this issue?
Well, I think it's BP's responsibility. I think BP's done some things, nothing to do with me. They clearly haven't done enough. They've spent some money, I believe. What I read in the newspapers, they've spent some money promoting tourism in the Gulf, but others know better than I about that.
I'll address that. BP initially spent $70 million, $25 million for the state of Florida, $15 million for the 3 other states. Requests have been denied by the governor of Florida and by about 10 Gulf Coast communities. Not denied, they have not received any other information. The governor of Florida was denied. The other communities have not heard anything back. And the challenge is it's $70 million, and as I stated earlier, very little of that has actually got to marketing. I think one of the most important things this committee, the BP, could do is isolate the funds and say, let's get experts working on this, and let's be sure they do the job. And I believe the gentleman to my right could do a terrific job overseeing that because he's proven himself. Thank you.
Yes, I thank all of you for your efforts, Mr. Feinberg. You and good luck on all your work. If I could, Mr. Chairman, just a point of personal privilege. I have spent vacations many summers on the panhandle of Florida and these sugar white sand beaches, which is, of course, the lure, and the notion that both the beaches would be despoiled, but also that the reputation of this area would be hurt is just so painful. I can only imagine how it is to all of you. So I thank you for being here.
Mr. Stearns is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Feinberg, the question would be, who's going to pay the salaries of the employees that you hire to implement this program and disbursement of the $20 billion?
BP.
BP.
Who?
And how many employees do you think that you'll expect? Can you extrapolate from your 9/11 experience?
Well, with 9/11, which was a relatively, thank goodness, a relatively modest claim cohort, we had 475 employees. BP, in paying out $230 million so far, has hired about 1,500 at 35 claims offices throughout the Gulf region, including, I think, 7 in Florida. Yeah. I'm now putting together a budget for the Gulf Coast Claims Facility. I think we probably won't need that many people, but I'll know more about that in the next week or two.
I understand. So it's roughly going to be 1,500 or less in your...
Correct.
And these employees will be paid by BP, the BP funds.
That's correct.
And the salary structure, is this going to be something like the private sector or the government sector, or the private sector, the government sector?
Again, the deputy administrator of the fund, Camille Byros, who's setting up the budget, she'd have a better handle on that, but I can certainly get you that information.
In 9/11, did you use, what standard did you use for salaries?
In salaries, we used Price Waterhouse had a contract with the Department of Justice that used largely private salaries.
Okay. I have here, I think it's a 4-page claim form that BP used for commercial fishermen. I notice on their form it does not have a notary public on it, and it's just that people can fill it out. Do you intend to use the same form, or are you going to come up with your new form?
New form.
New form. Okay. And I noticed that with BP, that 43% of the claims are still waiting payment. So that means, are you going to take over, inherit all those 43%? And does that mean that these people who supposedly haven't got claim, is lack of information, are you going to follow up on that?
Yes, we will not require people to refile. Now, that 43% figure, I'm not sure that figure is accurate.
Okay.
Because BP apparently has counted as a claim somebody who makes an inquiry and gets a claim number and never fills out the form. So I'm not sure. I got to get a handle on that data.
Okay. Let me just give you a statement and ask if you agree with this. Do you think everybody should get reimbursed no matter where they're located if they can prove loss of income because of this bill?
No. No.
Because, you know, a family could say, I'm in Tennessee, they're going to go to Pensacola. They say, we're not going to go to Pensacola, we're going to go to Tampa. And then the gas station on the interstate could say, well, golly, I just didn't get that family Tennessee, and make that claim. So, I mean, how are you going to work this so that it's a fair thing?
I have to listen to these experts that are at this table, like Mr. Malone. And Mr. Malone, in a very careful presentation, laid out for me sort of the proximity, the zone where there's the greatest direct impact, and said, Mr. Feinberg, in that zone in Alabama, that is the zone that is the most directly impacted. Tourism. These are the restaurants, the motels, the other sites. And with input from experts, I will try and answer that very question as to what's the proximity where it's most likely that a claim should be deemed eligible.
Mr. Feinberg, under 9/11, did you have anybody, accounting firm, come in and look at what you did? Was there anybody, not necessarily that you reported to, but somebody sort of like we have here, Inspector General, GAO, can go into a government agency and sort of tell members of Congress what's happening? Did you have that under the 9/11 Commission?
Constantly, the Office of Management and Budget.
Okay. Now, you're not going to have that here. Don't you think you would even want to have an Inspector General or a claims adjuster or somebody that could oversee this and report back to Congress on what you're doing instead of you reporting back on what you're doing yourself? Don't you think, I mean, I would think I would like to have somebody checking up on me just to make sure that I get the cross the dots.
I love that idea. I think we're going to do that. Now, we will have a separate question related. What about, I've heard this from various congressional committees, what about fraud?
Right.
What about the problem of fraud? Not so much auditing as just fraudulent claims.
Right.
The Department of Justice Criminal Fraud Division's working with us directly.
You'll refer them to the Department of Justice?
Absolutely. We'll have an internal, retained anti-fraud expert working within the facility to audit and check for fraud. But I absolutely have no problem with transparency in the form of congressional oversight or some sort of regular reporting by an independent person checking on what we're doing.
Mr. Chairman, I think what Mr. Feinberg's mentioning is something that this committee or some committee in Congress should help him with this legislation that allows him to report to, or they provide sort of a Inspector General type of accounting here. This is a huge amount of money, $20 billion, and I think the American taxpayers obviously would like some kind of report, and obviously we have great confidence in Mr. Feinberg, but I think at the same time he wouldn't mind having somebody to counterbalance and show that everything is going, because this is going to be 1,500 employees that are working in a way that's he can't control completely. So it's just a thought. Thank you, Mr. Feinberg.
Mr. Stern, your point is well taken, and it will be taken under consideration by this committee. Now we recognize Mr. Green of Texas, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you read a statement earlier, and I'd like to ask this question, Mr. Feinberg. We know BP's paid about over $200 million in emergency payments, and the committee's heard complaints about the BP's claims process. And Mr. Malone describes the process as erratic and somewhat convoluted and at times dysfunctional. I think that could probably apply to Congress in some cases. But Mr. Feinberg, I was hoping if you could comment on how BP's processed these claims so far. Specifically, what problems have you identified?
I think BP deserves some credit here. Most of these mass disasters that I've been involved in over the years, when I get involved, I start sort of from scratch. There's nothing in place, and we have to build from the beginning. While I am rushing to set up this facility in just a few weeks in August, BP continues to pay claims. Now, the problem is that, as my fellow witnesses have pointed out accurately, BP is quick to pay the individual wage loss claims. They're quick to pay claims where there is physical destruction, oil on the beach, or flowing somewhere, injuring property, destroying property. Where they're reluctant or where they have less assuredness is business interruption claims, lost profits, lost business, calculating lost business, corroborating lost business. And that's why I think the gentlemen that are here today testifying are frustrated by BP. Yeah, they've paid $230 million, but shouldn't they be doing more on the business side? And I appreciate that. And when I set up this facility, ASAP, we will focus on those business claims.
Okay. And so your testimony earlier that the claims will be actually what BP's doing, you're monitoring those, and they're coming to you now instead of BP directly.
They will be in the matter of weeks, and I'll accelerate the payment of those claims.
Okay. And how do you plan to staff a Gulf Coast claims facility?
We'll keep the people that are there now, we'll train them with the new facility. We'll keep those that we like. We will hire additional local vendors and local people in the 5-state area as needed, and we'll set up this new infrastructure in a matter of weeks. We're doing it now, actually.
Okay. Mr. Malone, do you have any response to that? I know compared to Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and obviously the Gulf Coast, the Florida upper coast, have you seen the payments getting better and more response?
As Mr. Feinberg said, the small payments to the individuals have been fairly routine matters. The payments to businesses that are in excess of $50,000, $100,000 and up, excess of $1 million, have been extremely difficult to obtain.
Is it because the documentation is harder to show?
It's very sporadic. There have been some spells where they have written some companies some large checks rather quickly. Other companies have been waiting nearly 3 months for their first check.
Okay. Well, coming from where I am, and obviously we were concerned about Galveston a couple of weeks ago, but not that we don't have tar balls on a regular basis, but that wasn't the issue. And I know in Southeast Texas, but my concern too is if each of you could comment not only on the VP's response, but also the impact of the moratorium, the hard 6-month moratorium we're seeing on whether it be Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana. And what are you seeing on that? And those folks, except for the workers, they probably are allowed compensation if you're laid off of a rig. Could you comment on that?
You talking to me or Mr. Feinberg?
Yeah.
I'm in tourism, sir. I'm not familiar with what's going on in the oil and gas industry. I know that our workers who are laid off get compensated. They go to the state unemployment office, and what that doesn't pay them, they get money from BP. Okay. I'm just not familiar with the oil and gas industry and what's going on with their workers.
If a rig worker was laid off as a direct result of the moratorium, BP agreed to set aside $100 million, not part of the $20 billion, a separate fund of $100 million just for moratorium rig worker claims.
Has that been pretty widely advertised, particularly in Louisiana? My colleague from Melanson, that would do it, because I have folks in my own district who work offshore. I have not heard, but the fear is that they're not going to be able to continue to work.
I think it's been fairly well publicized, and BP is now deciding where to deposit that $100 million, which will be earmarked only for unemployed moratorium rig workers.
Okay. I know I'm out of time. Do you know how much of that $100 million has been expended?
I don't think any of it yet. I don't think it's been deposited yet to pay out those claims.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your patience.
Dr. Gingrey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. We have spent most of the morning listening to our witnesses and asking questions, and of course, most of the questions and the testimony is around the issue of how we're going to get paid. And of course, everybody looks at Mr. Feinberg, of course. He's got a tremendous job and responsibility in seeing that that's done in a fair and equitable way. And it's important, and you brought out the fact that that time is of the essence. I think Mr. Feinberg may have said that. The others of you have said, well, gosh, you know, I think Mr. Overton talked about Florida, and even though there are no tar balls washing up on the beaches, the effect on the economy because of perception. And we talk about individuals, rig workers, and fishermen, and people that, you know, have these direct claims they're going to get processed real quickly. But the small business men and women across the country, the husband and wife that own the Motel 6, you know, maybe 100 miles, 70 miles, I think was mentioned, from the coast that are suffering because they depend on when all those motels along the coast are full in peak seasons. Thank goodness they call up their friends 70 miles away and say, have you got a vacancy? I mean, how many of us know when we traveled to Florida years ago with our parents that you just drive miles and miles and miles trying to find, and all you saw were these blinking neon signs that said no vacancy, and you'd have to go 70 miles inland. So, you know, there's a huge problem, and Mr. Feinberg, it probably extends a lot further than we realize today as far as economic losses. I want to real quickly, you know, Rahm Emanuel, the Chief of Staff to the President, was credited with making a statement, well, let no crisis go to waste. Now, from the political perspective, on our side of the aisle, we would say that's deplorable. But from a policy statement, if that's what he was talking about, then in fact I would agree that we should not let a crisis go to waste, and we should make an attempt to make lemonade out of these lemons, this huge lemon of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And you know what I think should be done? I'd love your opinion on it. The President's State of the Union address said, you know, we're going to take $30 billion of the TARP money, the unspent TARP money. We forced, in fact, the 9 or 10 largest financial institutions in the country to take that money even against their will. But it's been paid back, not completely, but to a large extent. And the President said, let's take $30 billion of that money and let's give it to, let's recapitalize the small banks and help them make loans, because small businessmen and women can't borrow the money that they need to stay afloat. Wouldn't this be a great opportunity for the federal government to listen to the President and to actually follow through on this and get money available to small community banks, not just in Florida, all along the Gulf Coast. Indeed, Georgia has 120 miles of coastline. In Florida and Georgia are two of the states that are seeing banks close every week on Friday. You know, on Saturday morning, you look to see, you know, which community bank is going under. And all these jobs are lost as a result of it. All these small mom and pops that invested $5, $10, $15, $25,000 to start that bank, to be part of the startup, raise $15 million or whatever, that money is totally wiped out. This would be a great opportunity to turn lemons into lemonade, and to get that money in the hands of these small banks so that these businesses that are waiting on Mr. Feinberg to adjudicate their claims would have money to stay in business. I'd like, Mr. Feinberg, we start with you, but I know this is not y'all's area of expertise, but you're all bright men and you know what I'm talking about, and we need to get this conversation going.
Am I safe if I say worthy of consideration?
How about damn worthy of consideration? Mr. Dow?
Yes, Mr. Gingrey, I think it's a admirable thought. When you talk about small businesses, you look at the Gulf Coast, it is probably almost all small businesses. New Orleans has big hotels and big companies, but you look at this Gulf Coast, this is made up of people who have relationships with these small banks. People know, they've got their records and all that, versus the larger banks, and I think it's all small business. And the other thing, I also think this is a phenomenal opportunity. There will be another hurricane, there will be another tsunami, there will be another earthquake. And this is an opportunity for us to set in place how we deal with these disasters so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And that's why I think this marketing fund we've talked about is so critical. And we can use this over and over again. But this is a great opportunity for the government to learn and to really set a process for the future.
Well, and I see my time is running out, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to extend too long here, but clearly, the president called for this to be done. It hasn't been done. This financial regulatory reform bill, the reason so many of us were opposed to it, it did nothing for Fannie and Freddie. But as far as this provision for some of that TARP money to the smaller community banks, it never happened. But it's not too late, and we need to really look into this closely, Mr. Chairman. I hope we have an opportunity to discuss it further. Mr. Chairman, I know some of the witnesses want to respond to this. It's up to you to whether or not. I'll shut up, and you can let them talk if you give them time.
Witnesses have a response? Yes.
I must say I think it's a great idea. But I'd be remiss if I did not impress upon you that this is still a liquid situation. Every day, there are those of us on the Mississippi Gulf Coast who are praying that the cap stays. There is still oil in the water. And granted, the discussion of payment is excellent. Your idea is excellent. But BP doesn't have enough money when we talk about perception over the years if the oil continues to come. So I think the idea of utilizing the community banks is great. But what the people on the Gulf Coast needs is reassurance. What they need, and only the federal government can give this, by the way, is the reassurance that it is safe. The reason, no matter how much advertisement BP does or we do in the tourism industry, if you don't think it's safe to go to the beach, then you're not going to take your kids. So you esteemed gentlemen are the ones who are in charge of the DMR, OSHA, the DEQ. You guys need to have, at BP's expense, an army of scientists, biologists, and marine biologists there assuring the rest of the world that it's okay. And first, assure them that there is no more oil in the water. So I think you have two components. I think Mr. Feinberg and BP with $20 billion will not be enough if we're still discussing this very fluid situation next year.
Mr. Daniels, your answer is pretty succinct. We're going to move on now because we have other members who want to question the witnesses. Mr. Gonzalez is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My question will go to Mr. Feinberg, and I've had the benefit of hearing your testimony in the Judiciary Committee, but I wasn't able to ask a question. I want to ask it at this time. At the time of your testimony last week before Judiciary, that same morning, Joe Scarborough, who's from Pensacola, was broadcasting his show from Pensacola and the beach, and he had a state senator. And the state senator made a couple of comments, and so I'll build my questions on the comments. The first one was, look at our beaches. They're beautiful, pristine, everything is fine. We're not getting people here. So it's the perception, and you've referred to this in the past, and I apologize. I wasn't here for all the testimony. And that is, Charlie Gonzalez is thinking of going to Pensacola, but I'm afraid there's oil, so I don't go. No one's at the hotel or motels. That hotel motel owner is a victim of some perception. It may be false. How are you going to handle that claim? What was disturbing to me was that the state senator's comment was, right now we've been dealing with BP on claims. Can you imagine now we're going to have to deal with the federal government? And you've already made it very clear that that's not your boss, neither is BP. But what would you say to that state senator? Why is it that this Gulf Coast Claims Facility is superior to what was in place prior to the agreement? And the second question is the one that I'd like for you to answer, if you don't mind, and then go to the perception of the beaches being spoiled and such.
I'd like to think that with the experience that I would bring and the confidence that the President and BP have in selecting me to do this, based on my prior work, in processing mass disaster claims. BP is an oil company, not a claims facility. I'd like to think that we will be able much more efficiently, much more effectively to process claims in a way that will engender the support of the people that I'm trying to help. All the talk in the world won't replace payments and a sense that people have and businesses have that there are actually checks being paid to eligible claimants. So the proof will be in the result in the next month, and I am hoping, with my fingers crossed, that the President's confidence in me and the administration's confidence in me and BP's confidence in me will result in the people in the Gulf having confidence in me so that the program is working and that it's credible.
And to the second question, and I don't know, not to prejudge any claims, but what do you do if the perception was that there was oil on the beach when there wasn't, but the businesses suffer?
You do not need oil on the beach to have a compensable claim. I want to emphasize this. Florida law may require, I don't know, Attorney General McCollum has a different view and probably the correct view, but you don't need oil on the beach. You don't have to be unable to fish. Perception is compensable. Now, the problem that Congressman Stearns and others pose, well, what's the proximity requirement? What's the dependence on that beach or on fishing or on charter boats or sightseeing? I will have to draw some lines on eligibility. The lines will be based on proximity to the beach or to the natural resources, fishing or what have you. The industry, fishing, crabbing, oyster harvesting is easy. Motels, restaurants, depending on the motel and type of restaurant, legitimate, eligible. And how dependent is that claimant on natural resources? And I'll have to, in the next few weeks, I'm going to have to develop eligibility criteria that will answer that question. Now, the claimant still has to prove the claim. Eligibility is one issue. Corroborating the claim by showing that the spill caused my loss, that's another issue. But that's what I'll have to deal with.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the other witnesses, though I may not have a particular question. Thank you for your testimony. Now yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Mr. Scalise of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been talked about by a number of you about the problems of perception, both with tourism, with food, the fact that even where some areas have absolutely no oil, you still got a double-digit, if not over 50% drops in people that are coming. And I want to start with you, Mr. Brennan. When we talk about how to combat that, especially once the oil, and we're all praying that this well is capped real soon, but there's still going to be oil that's got to be cleaned up, and there's still going to be perception problems. I know our state's worked on some different types of certification proposals to encourage FDA to set up a formal process so that people can go out there and actually have all across the country have a clear confidence level that if they're buying seafood, we know if you can buy it, it's safe, because our vendors aren't selling seafood that's unsafe, but there's a perception and a concern out there, and so a certification process would give a higher level of confidence. First, can you talk about both that combined with marketing? What is it going to take, in your opinion, to get people to feel comfortable walking into a seafood restaurant, not just in New Orleans, but anywhere in the country, to know if it's from the Gulf that it's safe?
Congressman, clearly there are two issues here. One is the damaged brand of the entire Gulf Coast as a tourist destination, and the other, which you just mentioned, is the food safety concern. And there are a number of regulatory agencies at the state and federal level that are now evaluating the safety of the seafood on a daily basis. And we need one consistent program that can become sort of the gold standard so that people will feel comfortable. I had an opportunity to have dinner with a lady the other night from Santa Monica, California. She said she would never eat Gulf seafood because despite what they're saying about it, she still believes that it is tainted in some way. And there are probably many people around the country that feel that way. And there are restaurants around the country that are posting signs saying we don't serve Gulf seafood. So we have a serious issue here, and we need one standard so that the country will feel confident that the seafood that comes out of the Gulf is of the
Thanks,
quality
Mr.
level.
Overton. We'll just go down the line.
The seafood industry in general, particularly when you talk about the fisheries of the Gulf of Mexico, have been underfunded for a long time, the research associated with it. And so, back to the earlier comments of how do we bring something good out of this crisis, I think it is an opportunity for us to take some funds and do some measurable data on the water columns, the baselines, and know how many fish we have, how many have been, this class of fish, is it totally destroyed or is it partially destroyed? It'll give us an opportunity to really look at what our data should tell us today. We don't have the funding currently to do that. And if I may, just one other point. When it comes to the perceptions, and Mr. Feinberg may have a comment on this, the complexity that we're faced with now is that we actually lose money in September and in August. We don't make a profit. We make our money in the other parts of the year. So what are we going to do if we don't have a claim paid by then? And by the way, for the record, I'm not aware of any business owner in Florida that's been paid a large claim as of yet. So what are we going to do? Are we going to become servants to the bank and our debt service coverage ratios, which are very important? Those covenants can't be broken. Or do we go lay employees off because we need to make that number? And that's what we're faced with.
And I apologize, I've only got a minute and a half left, and I've got a number of other questions. If Mr. Malone, if you can get me a copy of the presentation that you made to Mr. Feinberg, sounds like y'all really put some things together that made an impression on him. Would you be willing to share that with us as well? I'd love to see that too.
Can I speak briefly to another question about perception?
Real quick, if you can, because I've got some questions for Mr. Feinberg, and I've only got a minute now.
Okay. The science community is doing our region a terrible injustice. We tend to believe the EPA, the regulatory bodies, but every week some scientist from some university, it varies, is continually questioning the quality of the water, quality of the air. As long as those questions are out there, these misperceptions are going to be
all right, and I've got to get to my questions for Mr. Feinberg. As you've heard some of these comments from the panelists today, other conversations you had, can you help give them some confidence that when we talk about kind of some geographical limitations, if you've got a restaurant in New Orleans and it's 60 miles away from the point of impact, how are you going to factor that in?
I'm going to factor that in. Proximity makes it sort of a per se case. If you're right on the beach, or you're right by the Gulf, by the waters, it's sort of, that's what I mean when I say proximity, it's sort of easy. Yeah. That doesn't mean if somebody has another facility farther away, they're automatically ineligible. We'll take a look at the facts.
Real quick, too, on the escrow negotiations, are you kind of held back on what you can do to start setting up your operation and cutting checks for that to be completed, or can you start before they complete these escrow negotiations?
No, I'm not held up. We're on parallel tracks. The sooner the escrow's set up, the better. But meanwhile, I'm going forward setting up the infrastructure.
Can you cut any checks before the escrow negotiations occur?
No, but I'm confident that by the second week of August, which is already too late, I'm hoping that the escrow should be up and running so that there'll be no inability to cut checks.
Okay, and then you said with the $100 million, that's the only place to go for people who work on rigs. There's really no place to go that I've heard of for people at service rigs. Can they go to your fund? Would you pay them out of your fund? And if not, is just unemployment their only option at this point?
I don't know about unemployment. I can tell you that unemployed rig workers who are unemployed because of the government's moratorium don't have a claim against the BP.
Because once that $100 million is going to run out within 2 months if they start paying on it by any estimate that we've been given. And so once that's extinguished, do they have any recourse other than just going on unemployment? They're still unemployed and there's still a moratorium after 2 months.
I'm just suggesting I doubt very much that they would have a claim within this fund.
Okay, and then if you can give me offline here the protocols for review board. As you're setting up a process, if somebody disagrees with your ruling and they want to go to some kind of judicial process, what is that?
This is your last
Thanks,
question.
and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, the chair now recognizes Mr. Sarbanes of Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel. Mr. Feinberg, I was going to ask you some questions. you say that you're not privy to the negotiations that are going on with respect to the escrow fund. Are you okay with that? Do you think that's better from your standpoint, worse? What's your perspective?
I'm neutral. As long as the money is available when the Gulf Coast Claims Facility starts processing claims and cutting checks, that's fine with me.
Do your decisions, are they immune from challenge under whatever understandings have been?
No.
No. So if you and Mr. Malone are talking about the appropriate zone, and the government thinks you've drawn the zone too small, and BP thinks you've drawn the zone too big, or someone who's on the outside of the zone doesn't agree with your judgment call, are you anticipating that there's going to be some challenge presented to that, or under the structure of this arrangement, is that not challengeable?
Neither the government nor BP can challenge my independence. But if an individual claimant, business or an individual, doesn't like my eligibility determination, or doesn't like the amount of money that I've awarded, that individual has two choices. The individual can either, or not either, both. First, the individual can seek an appeal to 3 ex-judges or an appellate body that will review my decision. And only then can the claimant, who, if he or she is still dissatisfied, Congressman, can opt out of this system altogether and go file a lawsuit.
Gotcha. Was it a condition of your accepting this assignment that the BP and the government agreed that your judgment calls would not be challenged by them?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Malone talked about how there are people who, let's assume there's a good claim coming down the pipeline, and when it eventually gets to you, you're going to do the right thing, but it's not there yet, and the business that's seeking that compensation is in a position, as Mr. Malone described, where they may not be able to hang on as against the obligations they face from others, from third parties. Is there anything that can be done in your mind? Could you, even though you're not set up and ready to go, is there some kind of comfort letter or something that you can provide to that business that says, by all indications, you will be in a position to submit your claim to us once we're up and running, and you can use this letter and present it to third parties who may be leaning on you so they understand that, there's some recourse available to them? Is that something that's possible to do?
Yes. First, I'm going to be up and running in a matter of weeks. Now, that's too many weeks, but I understand that. That's small solace to somebody who's about to close their business. I'll be up in a matter of weeks. Secondly, if I know of that claim, BP is paying claims. If there's a claim like that I can't wait 2 weeks or 3 weeks for your letter or your promise or your willingness to deal with me. If I know of that claim, I'll go to BP for that claimant. I've done this already.
Okay.
To try and ease that transition.
So there is some recourse. If businesses can be identified that are kind of caught in the switches here, there's a way you can get that in front of BP and say, before it's too late, do something here while we're in this transition period. Okay. All right. Thank you. I yield back my time.
The chair recognizes Dr. Burgess for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for the consideration. I'm not part of the subcommittee, but I am part of the full committee. Mr. Feinberg, if I understood correctly in your answer to a question Mr. Barton asked, that the framework that is being set up surrounding your administering this fund is actually being done in the White House by an assistant attorney general. Is that correct?
the framework setting up my claims facility is being done by me. The framework for setting up the $20 billion escrow fund, my understanding is, because I'm not privy to those negotiations, is between the Associate Attorney General's office and people at BP in Houston.
Now, at some point, though, those two universes have to merge. Is that correct? Otherwise, you have a structure with no fund.
You got it.
And they've got a fund with no structure.
That's right.
When that merging occurs, will we on the Energy and Commerce Committee be made aware of what that structure looks like and how the fund then subsequently is to be administered?
I would think so. You'll certainly be entirely up to date on what I'm doing with the claims facility and how that's working, what the protocol is, how we're drawing on the money. There'll be full transparency as to what I'm doing.
Where will, well, let me just ask you this. When you worked, 9/11 was before my time, but when you worked administering that fund, for whom were you working?
I was working for the Department of Justice and Attorney General John Ashcroft.
So you received a paycheck from the Department of Justice?
I did. I worked on that assignment entirely pro bono.
Okay. Had you been paid, though, likely would have come from the Department
of Justice.
On this, are you working pro bono on this account?
No, I am not. The entire cost of this fund, the facility, Gulf Coast Claims Facility, must, of course, be paid by BP. You can't ask the claimants to fund any part of it, and you can't ask the government to fund any part of it.
Well, then that begs the question, who is signing your paycheck?
I am sure that BP is signing not only my paycheck, but is signing the paycheck of everybody working in this independent Gulf Coast Claims Facility.
How do you see any difficulty in maintaining the independence with them holding the title of paymaster?
I don't see any difficulty in maintaining my independence. I certainly do see the implication of your question, which is there could be a perception that since BP is paying, shouldn't we have more transparency or full disclosure, and I agree with that.
And I think that's where we'd like to be of service to you and provide some help to you. When the 9/11 compensation fund was set up, my understanding, again, I was not here, but that was set up under a congressional authorization or congressional charter. Is that correct?
It was a federal statute.
Right, but it was as a direct result of action taken in the United States
That's
Congress.
right.
But this is a little different.
Very different.
There has been no action taken in the United States Congress. So if we invite you, for example, to our Committee on Oversight and Investigations, if Chairman Rush invites you back to this committee, may we expect your attendance?
You certainly may, with honor.
Well, I will just say, as the ranking member on Oversight and Investigations, and who knows what will happen to the world after November, but as the current ranking member, we will welcome you back, or welcome you to that committee sometime this fall when you actually get funded, to have a visit about how those funds are actually being dispersed. And of course, we also will be terribly interested in how the merging of the structure that you're producing and the funding that is yet to happen. You know, we had a field hearing the 1st of June down at Chalmette, Louisiana. Chalmette virtually destroyed in Katrina, built back, and now they're being destroyed by the oil spill and then subsequently the moratorium. And there was a hotel operator there who talked about how he was keeping his cash flow going by borrowing, and having run a business before, I know it's hard to keep your cash flow going if you're borrowing. And I asked him who was co-signing his loans with him, and he said his wife. I said, well, that's not exactly what I had in mind. I was kind of hoping BP was co-signing those notes with you, and he said no such luck. Are we going to get to a point where that individual or an individual in similar circumstance can continue to maintain their business without facing future financial ruin?
That'll be my goal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesy. I'll yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Millicent for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you allowing me to wave on. If I would, I'd like to submit a statement for the record since I'm not a member of the subcommittee.
Order.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to welcome my friend Ralph Brennan with the Restaurant Association. We worked many years ago on a promotion for Louisiana, not only out of Louisiana, but also internationally. And I guess my question to you is, do you remember how many years it took us to build that reputation once we got that fund up and running?
Congressman, I don't remember the number of years, but it's a long time.
And so we're right now kind of reverting back to where we were, and we're going to have some ability, as well as Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and Texas, to get that message back out once this Gulf has been cleaned up. So it's a long time coming.
Yes, sir.
So I guess, Mr. Feinberg, is there any indication from BP of how long they're going to be in this thing, or are they thinking that this $20 billion is the all-to-end-all, and is it going to be the end then?
BP has made it very clear publicly and privately that if the $20 billion isn't enough, and I certainly hope it is, but if it isn't enough, they have promised to honor any additional financial obligations that might be its responsibility.
Mr. Feinberg, if I could, can you tell me what the hell this Alabama lawsuit's about?
I'm sorry?
This Alabama lawsuit, what is that about? I mean, BP is a responsible party. They're obligated not only for the money, but for paying for the administration of it. So somebody's filing, Alabama, I think, is filing suit.
I'm not.
That was something I'd heard on the news the other day. I was wondering what that was all about. Maybe I didn't get my full information. Ralph, let me ask you, as a person from Louisiana, and for the Mississippi folks, I spent quite a number of days along the coast, including the Mississippi Gulf Coast after Katrina. We're all in this thing together. I fully support every state that's been affected, whether it was from the storms or whether it's from BP. I wasn't here for the opening statement, and I apologize to all of you for that. But Ralph, is there anything since the discussions have started that has come to your mind that you wish you may have said, or you might want to still say, while I still have 2 minutes and 30 seconds?
Congressman, all I would say is, and I said this in my opening remarks, this is a long-term problem. Unlike Katrina, it was a fixed event. It was over. We knew what we had to do. We don't know the long-term effects of this on especially Louisiana, the tourism industry, and the seafood industry. And so we have to take an approach today, and we have to start today knowing it's going to be a long-term battle. I think you mentioned that earlier. We can't just end this at any date certain. It may go on for many, many years. And we've had conversations with tourism industry officials and seafood officials from Alaska, and after the Valdez incident, they've told us it's taken 5 to 10 years for them to overcome the effects of just that spill.
As I've mentioned to my colleagues and others that will listen in the media, what our problem is, I guess, Mr. Feinberg, is what we don't see out there in the marshes and the Gulf that are the concerns for us for the future. And that's why, knowing that you fully well see the long term, it's not like a 9/11, we settle and we're done and we walk away. And that's where I may not be around, either because the Lord doesn't wish it for me or whatever, but I just hope that maybe that the people will be made whole in some way, shape, or form. I want to thank the chairman for having this hearing as we continue to move forward to understand the problems that are faced by the people of the Gulf Coast of this country, and hope that whatever we do, the resolve will be such that it will be a model for the future. So, Mr. Feinberg, I pledge you and your folks full cooperation of my office as long as I am in office to help you with this problem. And again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you all for allowing me to wave on to the committee. Back to balance my time.
That said, the chair want to inform all the members, all the witnesses, that you have been very patient. You have participated and informed this subcommittee far beyond our expectations. But we certainly are appreciative of your sacrifice of your time that you committed to this process. Yes. Mr. Dow, you had a...
Mr. Chairman, may I make one statement? One of the more moving and impressive things that I've seen is in September of 2008, you returned to the House on the floor to personally support the Travel Promotion Act, which is now law. You appreciate, you understand what promotion can do.
Yes.
Your heroism being there, but most important, I'm going to ask this committee and Congress if we can move forward and push for a $500 million fund, it is not in Mr. Feinberg's purview, but if we do this, we can limit significantly what is going to be spent in damages and recovery, and you understand that as well as anyone. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, the chair does understand, and the chair is, personally is fully committed to that. However, the committee will take that under consideration and give its intense insight or its intense interest in that, and we will engage in a process to determine what our next steps should be. But I want you to know that I do understand. I know how important it is. And the chair, as was indicated earlier, really appreciate all the witnesses for your time. I know that Mr. Feinberg does have a 12:30 deadline that he has to meet in terms of leaving. And so with that in mind, the committee now stands adjourned.